warm welcome to the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub workshop on Finfluencer regulation, retail investor protection in the age of social media. Before we dive into the workshop, please allow me to share a few words about the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub. Established in 2017, the hub in Kuala Lumpur is the first regional hub of IOSCO set up to enhance the regulatory capabilities of IOSCO members. And to date, the hub has conducted programs on various aspects of regulation and has trained over 1,800 IOSCO members worldwide from across 110 jurisdictions. Today's workshop is part of the hub's ongoing efforts to promote knowledge transfer and expertise sharing amongst IOSCO members, with today's workshop especially trying to address the vital topic of influencer regulation. This workshop is also being held in conjunction with World Investor Week, a global initiative promoting investor education and protection. And in exploring the regulation of influencers, we acknowledge its pivotal role in empowering investors with the knowledge and tools for informed financial decisions. This panel discussion will also be recorded for the benefit of all IOSCO members and will be made available over on the IOSCO Hub's website. Before I pass over to Lyn, who is our moderator for the panel session today, to kickstart the session together with our esteemed speakers, Tyler Fleming from the Ontario Securities Commission and Gerri Walsh from FINRA, I'm honored to welcome Pasquale Munafo, Chairman of the IOSCO Committee 8 for Retail Investors, to share the work of the C8. And following Pasquale, we also have Gloria Caballero Nunez, who will be providing a brief on the work of the Finfluencer Working Group of Committee 8, setting the stage for the panel discussion later. Without further ado, let's welcome Pasquale to share his remarks.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it is an enormous pleasure for me to open this very relevant initiative dedicated to one of the hottest topics of the moment within the securities regulators' agendas. It is very timely to be here in Kuala Lumpur, also as the headquarters of the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub, to talk about Finfluencers and communicate our interest in exploring and finding some preliminary shared points about this phenomenon. So many thanks to the Hub and its staff for organizing such an event and for having invited me. I'm here today together with a few outstanding colleagues, also my mates at the IOSCO Committee 8 or Retail Investor, that, as you may know, is the policy committee of IOSCO dealing with the retail investor education and investor protection. In fact, this week, the Committee on Retail Investors is meeting to discuss ways to enhance investor protection through financial education initiatives in two critical and somehow related areas, crypto assets and influencers. My very short introduction today aims to give a bit of context to stress how social media are impacting our daily lives, including the investment sphere, and how IOSCO is dealing with this. Retail investors can now easily find recommendation and advice just surfing the web and drawing on the endorsement of celebrities and other famous individuals to make investment decisions. So the most impacted are, of course, younger generation who generally have low levels of financial literacy and who are more keen to digital tools and resources. In a few words, they represent a perfect target for influencers, also in connection with other developments in the digital investment landscape, such as cryptos and digital engagement practices. Regulators and policymakers should keep the pace, adapt the regulations to new needs, especially in terms of investor protection. We can identify severe challenges ranging from the cross-country dimension to numerous gray areas, such as conflicts of interest, unclear responsibilities for retail investor losses, low transparency, and we could ask ourselves whether traditional supervisory tools are still suitable to cope with this new phenomenon. Jurisdictions are moving into the topic. Just a matter of example, in Europe, ESMA has communicated early this year the purpose to look at social media and influencers as part of its common supervisory action on marketing by financial services firms more generally. Moreover, in the recent retail investment strategy launched by the European Commission, some measures have been proposed in terms of supervisory expectation with the purpose to ensure that influencer marketing communication are properly addressed and investment firms are deemed to be liable for the content provided. This does not mean, of course, to stifle innovation and limit the use of new tools to increase the retail participation to the market, rather to find the right balance between risks and opportunities. Financial technologies and social media are here to stay, so we need to be ready to take advantage of these developments while supporting investor protection. It should be noted in this regard the potential use of social media and new digital tools to foster the involvement of retail investors also by means of increasing their financial literacy. IOSCO has a leading role to play in this context. The Retail Market Conduct Task Force final report in March 2023 pointed out that social media has become increasingly integrated into the retail investing landscape, giving their users easy access to investments that may be unsuitable, misleading, or fraudulent. So other surveys at local level conducted by national authorities have confirmed this upward trend. So to conduct a specific projects in the area of investor protection in a digitalized context stemming from the Retail Market Conduct Task Force report, IOSCO established the Retail Investor Coordination Group in June 2023 that has been designed as a recognition of the increasing retail investor participation in markets with a corresponding increase in the influence of technological and social media development. We can pose risks that are often cross-border in nature. So its objective is to ensure high-level coordination for IOSCO investor protection work. This is consistent with IOSCO strategic investor protection objective, notably to deter the increasing retail online misconduct, which in turn exacerbate challenges IOSCO members are facing in protection of retail investors. In addition to the benefits of coordination, RACG aims at increasing the public visibility of IOSCO investor protection efforts. To achieve the intended objectives, the RACG thinks holistically and strategically about the different pieces of investor protection work so that the joint work achieves the best possible and complementary outputs that can arise out of synergy and coordination among the standing committees. Hence, the RACG brings policy, investor education, and enforcement aspects under the holistic umbrella of investor protection, which is one of the three core objectives of IOSCO. The RACG is chaired by David Rowland from the Central Bank of Ireland and composed by the chairs of the Committee 3, 4, and me, chair of the Committee 8. So the RACG has held 4 meetings and has set up the joint working groups between the 3 policy committees to conduct a list of 7 projects which came out from the Retail Market Conduct Task Force report. These projects can be broadly grouped under 2 headings: combating online frauds and emerging retail market conduct issues. So the 2 projects under the first heading deal with preventing unlicensed service providers and online fraud and mis-selling respectively. They are mainly led by C4 with input from C3. Their objective is to alleviate the persistent online cross-border fraud problem in practical ways that help IOSCO members with their day-to-day supervisory enforcement challenges. The other projects under heading 2, this emerging retail market conduct issue, largely deal with the risk brought by the technological developments, new brokerage trends, and increasing impact of social media on retail trading and retail investor protection, areas in which there is a lot of public and press attention and need for global guidance. They are mainly led by the C3 and C8. One of the set projects is about the main topic of the workshop today, that is Finfluencers. The objective of this mandate, led by the C8, is to assess the emerging trends and investor protection risks that stem from influencer activity and provide guidance against such risks. So Gloria will talk about it shortly. Then we have other 3 projects led by these 3. One on copy trading was mandated assessing the potential risks and harms to retail investors of copy trading and how such risks and harms could be mitigated in light of the rapid rise in the level of self-directed trading since COVID-19. The second is on broker-dealer conflicts of interests, to assess investor protection issues that stem from conflicts of interest in broker-dealer activities. It aims to identify and assess conflict of interest which may be hidden or not be readily apparent. The third is about fractional asset trading that will, as a diagnostical internal report, assess the emerging trends and retail investor protection risks in fractional trading, asset trading, and how such risks can be mitigated. And last but not least, a project led by C3 and C8 on digital engagement practices that will look at the retail investor risks and potential harmful conduct from the use of these practices by market intermediaries targeting retail investors, and consider how to mitigate the conduct risks and help IOSCO members in shaping their regulatory approach. So I stop here. I provided some information that I hope you have found useful to contextualize the workshop. My colleagues will have in a few seconds the pleasure to deep dive on the influencer topics. Let me conclude to wish you a fruitful workshop and with the invitation to contribute to the work in this very innovative and fascinating area.
First of all, I want to thank Asia Pacific Hub for the invitation to explain the work to be done on Finfluencers under the leadership of Committee 8. I'm sure that the participation in this workshop is a unique opportunity to learn from each other. Investor protection is one of the main objectives of IOSCO. Many retail investors, particularly younger people, make decisions influenced more by social media and the advice of friends, family, and celebrities than by recommendations from professional registered investment advisors. In this context, the growing phenomenon of financial influencers presents a new and significant challenge for retail investor protection. Considering the challenges and risks associated to the figure of influencers, IOSCO has identified this issue of influencers as a priority for 2023 and 2024, and that's the reason Committee 8 started working on it. The objective of the project is to assist retail investors in acquiring the necessary critical thinking skill, attitudes, and behaviors to identify, first, possible financial scams and fraud from influencers. Second, whether or not a influencer is licensed to provide investment recommendations. Third, whether or not a influencer receives any kind of remuneration for recommending specific investments or has other conflicts of interest or incentives for providing recommendations that may not be in the investor's best interest or doesn't align with investor's risk profile. And the last one, how to interpret a influencer's disclaimer. During the work, we have to consider different stakeholders as social media platforms, TikTok, Meta, Twitter, YouTube, companies with business agreements with influencers and content creators, and consumers and retail investors. And what will be the main deliverables? The main deliverables will be, first, observations on the current risks and opportunities presented by influencers and their impact on retail investors, a toolkit with sound practices, guidance, and methods for providing investor education and investor protection considerations aimed at protecting against fraud or unsuitable recommendations. The toolkit will consider as well the policy actions regulators have taken or could have taken on this matter. A possible code of conduct for influencers, technology companies, and new media or digital agencies that each regulator could adapt in accordance with the regulator's mandate, laws, or regulation. And we want to prepare as well a plan for a coordinated investor education campaign on social media, including but not limited to activities for the World Investor Week next year. Next steps will consist on the preparation of a survey in order to collect information about investor education and policy aspects, We want to have a dialogue with experts, to organize meetings and roundtables with jurisdictions active on the issue of influencers. We want to collect data, and we would like to have input from leading influencers to know their perspective. And I'm sure some of these issues to be discussed today will be very useful for us to develop the Committee 8 work. Thank you very much.
Welcome everyone to this panel discussion, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lyn, and I'll be the moderator for today for the discussion entitled Finfluencer Regulation, Retail Investor Protection in the Age of Social Media. So today's webinar, as has been mentioned, is in conjunction with World Investor Week 2023, and we are pleased to have with us a distinguished panel of experts who will be sharing their insights on this important topic. So some introductions. Joining us today on your far left is Tyler Fleming, who is the Director of the Investor Office, a regulatory branch of the Ontario Securities Commission that educates and protects investors and consumers. As the first director of the new Investor Office, Tyler was responsible for the vision, strategy, and execution of the office's launch in October 2015. Tyler also established and leads the OSC's behavioral science team, a first for a Canadian securities regulator. As leader of the Investor Office, he oversees a diverse team of professionals that include lawyers, accountants, behavioral scientists, researchers, educators, as well as technology experts. Now, prior to joining the OSC, Tyler served on the senior management team of the Ombudsman for Banking Services and Investments and worked at a prominent national management consulting firm. He is also a frequent speaker in Canada and internationally on investor and consumer protection, financial education, and behavioral science topics. Now, of course, we also have with us this morning Gerri Walsh, seated in the middle here, who is Senior Vice President of Investor Education at the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, better known as FINRA. In this capacity, she is responsible for the development and operations of FINRA's Investor Education Program. She's also president of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, where she manages the foundation's strategic initiatives to educate and protect investors, as well as to benchmark and foster financial capability for all Americans, especially underserved audiences. Now, Gerri was also the founding executive sponsor of FINRA's Military Community Employee Resource Group. She also serves on the Advisory Council to the Stanford Center on Longevity and represents FINRA on IOSCO's Standing Policy Committee on Retail Investor Education, the Jumpstart Coalition for Personal Financial Literacy, NASA's Senior Investor Advisory Council, and the Wharton Pension Research Council. All to say, ladies and gentlemen, we have two very distinguished people joining us today and who will be sharing their insights with you. Now, of course, we will be taking questions towards the end of this session, which is going to last for about an hour. But considering that we are quite an intimate gathering, I think if anyone has any burning questions throughout, please feel free to raise your hands, and a member of the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub will be with you very shortly with a microphone for you to ask your questions. So let's get stuck in. So Tyler and Gerri, now the growth in digitalization and the increasing use of social media are changing the way financial products are marketed and distributed. So in this context, new and significant challenges for retail investor protection have emerged in relation to activity conducted by financial influencers, also often known now as finfluencers. Now, there's no standard definition of the term currently. How do you see the challenges posed by this absence of a standardized definition? And do you think that perhaps we should be considering a more globally accepted definition in the context of securities regulation?
I can start. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd just like to say what an honor and a privilege it is to be asked to participate in this panel with my esteemed colleague, Gerri Walsh, and with our colleagues from IOSCO Committee 8 on Retail Investors, and with our colleagues at the Asia Pacific Hub. So thank you again. As you've already heard, the rise of Finfluencers is a top regulatory issue and a top of the IOSCO agenda right now. Gloria set out the work that Committee 8 has just begun on Finfluencers that will include developing a toolkit of approaches for us as regulators to consider. It will be exploring risks and opportunities with Finfluencers, as well as some of the common definitions and other issues, and then potentially exploring a code of conduct as part of its deliverables. So these are all really important projects. With respect to influencers and Finfluencers specifically, I think while there's maybe not a set definition, there are some commonly understood elements to what constitutes a Finfluencer. So generally, a Finfluencer could be considered someone who provides investment ideas, opinions, or advice with their audience, typically through social media. They may or may not receive compensation for it, but typically they're able to shape behavior through through the messages that they provide. Where I think there's maybe a particular lack of definition is around which Finfluencers and Finfluencer activity should be within our regulatory perimeters. So what activity and what sorts of Finfluencers should be regulated or not, what sort of activities are within our scope of remit to pursue, and what should properly fall outside our perimeter. So I think there's a lot of really interesting work happening in that regard right now, and as you heard, IOSCO Committee 8 has just begun a lot of this work.
The element that I would add, again, thank you for having us here, and thank you to the Asia Pacific Hub. It is such an honor to be here. As a self-regulatory body, FINRA oversees one small slice of the securities industry, an important slice, the broker-dealers that sell investments to the American public, but we do not have jurisdiction over investment advisors or banks. We also don't have jurisdiction over the issuers. And so we have that narrower remit. But when we look at the issue of Finfluencers, that portmanteau of, finance and influence, it's a new concept, it's a new delivery vehicle, but it's an old reality. There have always been people that have touted investments. There have always been promoters. There have always been finders that have led clients to firms, that have suggested strategies or products, that have dispensed advice, whether it qualifies as investment advice or not, and whether they're registered as investment advisors or brokers, whatever the appropriate investment professional regulation would be. So, I think that some of the existing rules and frameworks that we have individually as jurisdictions, but then also globally as connected regulators still apply. And I think we need to be creative about making sure that we apply those existing standards.
Thank you very much, Gerri and Tyler. So, Gerri, I just wanted to perhaps dig a little bit deeper on what you were speaking about, which was in effect that this is not entirely perhaps a new reality for regulators, but given the nature of social media, its borderless nature, its certainly the wide reach that these financial influencers who may not have any kind of true background in finance are able to achieve, given the nature of social media, I suppose, how would you break down the specific realities of Finfluencers that we may perhaps like to pay attention to?
There are a couple of elements that I can discuss from our experience at FINRA. One is from the broker-dealer community. They're very much aware of whether they are using social media influencers, Finfluencers, to help them build their business, whether it's through rewards programs or, encouraging highly followed Finfluencers to drive traffic to the firm. And the rules that apply to broker-dealers in the United States apply to the activity, to the relationships that they have with those social media influencers. So to the extent that a firm is compensating a social media influencer, that influencer has to disclose that. And the firm becomes responsible for the statements that that influencer makes about the firm, about its products, about encouraging people to engage in certain behaviors or certain strategies. And so, from the perspective of the broker-dealer, all the rules about communicating with the public apply. And in the United States, as in many jurisdictions, the rules are that the communications that a broker-dealer or its registered representatives make with the public have to be fair and balanced and not misleading. And there has to be disclosure about compensation when somebody is paid to make a recommendation about a particular security or a security strategy. That's something that has to be disclosed. And so the other element, though, is the perspective of the financial influencer. And some of them don't even realize that they're getting themselves into deep, dark waters where they probably should be registered as an investment advisor if they're providing financial advice that gets into investment advice. Even if they perceive themselves as a financial coach, somebody who's just giving good tips, right? That's something that could cross a line, and particularly in our country, in the United States, there are numerous securities regulators. There's the SEC, there's the CFTC, there's FINRA, but there are also individual state securities regulators. And so you need to be aware as a influencer what the rules of the road are. And, if you are getting compensation, you want to know, what the do's and don'ts that the firm would impose on you. And those do's and don'ts are the same rules of the road that the broker-dealer itself has to follow. So making sure that the information is not misleading, that there aren't promises or, projections of certain levels of return that you're going to get for a particular product. All of those rules of the road apply to the finfluencer that is engaging in that conduct. And even if it's, the written supervisory procedures that firms are supposed to have in place, that's something that FINRA is taking a close look at with broker-dealers, because firms have got to have these WSPs, as we call them for short, these written supervisory procedures to make sure that the firm is on top of how they're managing these finfluencers with respect to referrals or rewards programs, whether it's cash compensation or it's some other form of compensation. It's something that the firm has to stay on top of. And also, they need to protect the privacy of the firm's customers, because often these third-party influencers are getting information from the firms, and a firm has to be careful to make sure that it's not violating the privacy regulations in the United States.
Thank you, Gerri. Now, I also just want to sort of flip the conversation a little bit, because we've been talking about the finfluencers themselves up until this point. But I also wanted to take a look, perhaps, at the investor, at those who would be potentially influenced by the material that is being sort of driven to them, in some cases on social media. Now, recent research from the CFA Institute, as well as the FINRA Foundation, revealed how access to investment products, sources of investment knowledge, and macroeconomic uncertainty are factors in particular, Gen Z's financial decision-making. So could you perhaps, both of you, just tell us a little bit more about any recent observations you may have on how finfluencers are affecting Gen Z's financial decisions in particular?
It's fascinating to see that these youngest investors, for one thing, about 82% of them were investing before age 21. So these are people that have been in the markets, that have had vehicles. The frictionless ability to invest through apps is something that's highly appealing to younger investors. And the prevalence of social media and the ease with which one can access the internet. This is truly the first generation that are digital natives, and it shows in the way they invest. But one of the things that's fascinating is that almost half of Gen Z investors say that they use social media as a primary source of getting information, but friends and family are actually a higher and more important source, a more trusted source. So it's interesting to see that while this is the generation that's most likely to use social media, to engage with it, they don't necessarily trust it. They understand its constraints. So friends and family, general internet searches are very important to Gen Z, but social media is a huge driver and a huge topic of interest. And in speaking in informal groups of investors and consumers, people will say that they turn to social media first, but they also have some skepticism.
So there's a lot of really interesting work that's been done by FINRA and CFA Institute, as you mentioned. I thought I'd just mention another piece of work that's underway right now in Ontario. And for those of you less familiar, I live in Toronto. Ontario is a Canadian securities regulator. Like the US, there are many Canadian securities regulators. My colleague from Quebec is here, the AMF. I think we're forever required to explain at IOSCO meetings why we're two provinces instead of a country here. So nonetheless, a very confusing environment. But with respect to the research that we are currently conducting, so we know a lot about how people report where they get information. We've done some studies as well. But as regulators, it's really important to get as much data and evidence as possible. So we are conducting a behavioral science study right now that is conducting an experiment to actually see how investors actually behave and how influencers can drive behavior. So in a simulated environment, we're testing different formulations of either influencers or authorities, such as regulators, and what sort of messages, what sort of activities drive investor behavior and how that can inform our regulatory toolkit. So a lot of interesting findings we hope to share soon. One thing I will mention about the nature of the Finfluencer relationship that we've already uncovered, though, and I think it's really key in understanding some of the investor behavior, is that notwithstanding talking about Finfluencers as being a social media phenomenon, it's actually a parasocial relationship, and I think that's the right word. But in the sense, it's one direction, right? So you may feel you have a relationship with this person, you follow them, you like their posts, you comment on them, you are feeling you have a personal relationship. That person may not know who you are, and they might not follow you, and they might not know you exist. But that illusion of a relationship, and an intimate relationship at that, drives a lot of behavior, because it can inspire feelings of trust. It can inspire feelings that it's authentic, relatable. There's the concept of reciprocity. So if if the person does engage with your comment, you feel, okay, now I'm really close with this person, and you want to please them, right? So there's all sorts of really important behavioral elements that drive investor behavior in the Finfluencer relationship. Your original question asked about, Gerri had commented on how a lot of the behavior we've seen a long time. It's the platform and the channel that's new. There's always been touters. There's always been this sort of activity. But certainly for us as regulators, exploring, the speed with which technology can spread messages, the ease of interaction where decisions can be made with a simple click, inserting appropriate information from sources such as regulators or others at the time of a decision is really key. How do we make sure that our information, or information that's not necessarily unsuitable or driving inappropriate action, is there? And that's a challenge we're all wrestling with, for sure.
And one of the things that I believe it was the Swiss Financial Institute did a report on the sort of level of understanding that some of the investors had, looking at the level of knowledge that financial influencers had. And there was a determination that, many of these financial influencers are anti-skilled. And so, if you have people with lower levels of financial knowledge, financial capability, sort of listening to people that, are anti-skilled, you're going to be seeing suboptimal and quite negative results in your portfolio. So it's really an important issue for regulators to get their arms around. But the whole behavioral element is something that speaks to my heart, because at the FINRA Foundation, we've been looking at some of these drivers. And, when you think about the, kind of the persuasion tactics that are used commonly in marketing and legitimately, right? It's a legitimate thing. But when fraudsters take those elements and reciprocity, social consensus, scarcity, all of those factors, when they come to play, especially in the fast pace of social media, it's a toxic combination.
So it is a really interesting phenomenon as well, what the both of you are discussing, and particularly, I think how Tyler put it, the parasocial sort of element of these one-way relationships. Now, I just wanted to perhaps talk a little bit about how investors can then really dissect the information that is presented to them, because Finfluencers do sometimes add disclaimers to their content, but these disclaimers are sometimes not transparent. They perhaps fail to disclose the full extent of the information that is required about their backgrounds, about their licenses, about potential conflicts of interest. So how then can investors sort of really dig into this information, into these disclaimers, and what are some ways to help retail investors evaluate the information that they're presented with on social media?
So disclosure is a really interesting area, because even if someone is disclosing fees, risks, conflicts of interest, it can sometimes have the unintended consequence of giving almost license to the person. So because I've disclosed this to you, you will trust me even more, or I will trust you even more. So disclosure is a really interesting phenomenon. I think when we're talking about how information is disclosed or presented on social media, we have to talk about media literacy more broadly as well, in terms of verifying information that's presented. How do we trust what we're seeing, and how do we validate it and verify? So it's much broader than just influencers. I think we have to be part of a broader conversation as technology keeps changing. I think we've had some interesting discussions at IOSCO Committee 8 the past couple days, including around the use of artificial intelligence to create generative artificial intelligence to create deep fakes and replicas, and we're all very concerned. We have that pit in our stomach around what's coming down the pipe with respect to fraud and all that. So that's a whole separate conversation, but I think we have to consider media literacy and work with partners outside the financial and securities regulatory context in this area as well.
I think it's really important as well to help people get quickly to the sources of information that are unbiased, and regulators are such a rich and robust source of information. But if we take, a very preachy, teachy, kind of I know better than you attitude toward investors, that will turn virtually any investor away, but particularly Gen Z. And when we encourage them to do their own research, we have to recognize, even as we say those words, that by going to some of the prominent social media sites, they believe they are doing their own research. And so do your own research by, and not just visiting our website, but here's the tool, or here's the resource, or here are the considerations. That's awfully hard to do in the length of an X or a tweet, whatever the right word is, but 140 characters, right? We have to recognize that this generation has changed, right? Newer investors have shorter attention spans. I think all of us have shorter attention spans. We all have TLDR, too long, didn't read, in our mindset. So we have to be pithy in how we get this information across, but we have to be specific as well.
And if I could just add, I liked your use of the word preachy, teachy, which is what we can't be. I think here's where we can actually learn from influencers and finfluencers and what makes people gravitate towards them in the first place. I think it's important for us to be accessible and authentic and meet people where they are and speak their language, even if that is an emoji. And as regulators, be relatable and trustworthy and accessible. That is uncomfortable for many regulators. it's a new area for many. Many have taken further steps, but I think we have to have that conversation and continue advancing that.
The other phrase I have is scoldy moldy.
Scoldy moldy.
As you were speaking, I had this vision of regulators en masse turning to turning to TikTok, and I was like, I wonder how that would go.
No dancing videos, I hope, though. Not the people in this room, at least.
Okay, so, but jokes aside, so reflecting, I think, Tyler, you mentioned kind of fraud issues as well. I wanted to kind of reflect on some of the stock manipulation schemes that we've seen on social media platforms, and how can regulatory responses be informed by these incidences in order to avoid similar fraudulent activities in the future? I mean, in the realm of influencer marketing, how can the industry also ensure ethical practices, such as the transparency and disclosure requirements that we've just been talking about? Do share, perhaps, if you can, perhaps we'll Tyler first for any information from your jurisdiction, and then to Gerri for a slightly kind of a broader industry view.
Sure. So with respect to fraud, we certainly saw a large increase in fraud through social media when crypto came to prominence. So I think that is a fairly common experience all around the world. And we saw, I'll use Finfluencer generously here, fraudsters, using some tactics that were effective and they continue to try. So fear of missing out. You know, there was the phrase in English, have fun staying poor, I think, or something like that. Really high pressure tactics, flaunting their wealth, showcasing an image that was aspirational to others and convincing people to get in on the action. We saw the crypto crash in winter and a lot of firms collapse in North America and around the world. And so you asked how we can use these incidents. I think when a big event happens, like a fraud that's in the news, it's a very salient event. People have lost money, and that's tragic, but it helps sharpen a message in a timely way by sharing those very vivid examples. In Canada, a few years ago, there was the Quadriga case. It was a crypto asset trading platform that collapsed. The founder disappeared. So not Finfluencer, but we at the Ontario Securities Commission were able to use that in delivering a message through social media and other channels by publishing a plain language social media friendly report, breaking that into bite-sized chunks. There's even a Netflix documentary where the OSC was appeared, so that was a little celebrity moment for a regulator. But nevertheless, there are ways, as sad as these stories are, they resonate with people and they're timely, and we can use that to drive some messages.
We've seen in the United States the rise of celebrities to promote cryptocurrency, so sort of a corollary to what you were saying, Tyler. And there have been some actions that have been taken against some of those celebrities for largely failing to disclose that they were compensated for touting a particular cryptocurrency. We also have seen social media cases that have involved sort of the misuse of finders to drive business to investment advisors. But you know, in the fraud space, there is a tension that I think all of us probably feel. In the United States, the right to free speech is enshrined in the First Amendment. So we think of it as sort of a First Amendment issue that, you know, people should be able to say certain things. And, you know, that might be that they show their portfolio, and you know, while I would never take a screenshot of my portfolio and post it on social media, there's potentially nothing wrong with that, and that is in tension with this idea of, you know, there can be statements that are made to perpetrate frauds. And so there was a great deal of attention on, you know, the meme stock GameStop in the United States and Roaring Kitty, and you know, ultimately there wasn't action that the regulator was able to take against some of the people that were recommending this stock because they believed, you know, this notion that you know, that this was going to be a good investment. So that's something too to keep in mind. It's one of the sort of challenges is how do you draw that line? Where is that line? And sometimes, you know, pretty significant regulatory resources are devoted to tracking down whether fraud happened, whether a line was crossed, and if so, by whom. And it doesn't always yield the result that one might expect. So part of what we end up telling investors is to remember that, and this goes back to the research that I know Tyler has been doing, fundamentally, social media is about emotion. And it's about the emotions it inspires. It's the parasocial relationship that you have with the Finfluencer, or it's this notion that, you know, FOMO, fear of missing out, you might be missing the opportunity of your lifetime. But in my experience, birth is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and death is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Pretty much everything else, you can have do-overs. So it's you know, it's a tough line, and not every wrong is a fraud, and not every fraud is actionable, and that's also tough for regulators.
So, considering the very fine line that regulators then have to strike in terms of trying to achieve a balanced, efficient, effective regulatory environment, not a new challenge, of course, but one that is increasingly pertinent as we face the prevalence of social media and the rise of influencers. I suppose, what are the kinds of things that regulators should be keeping in mind as they grapple with this issue, specifically in respect to these influencers? Perhaps you could share any examples that you may have come across.
Well, so there is, I guess, a fine line, but there's many tools in the regulatory toolkit, I would say. So the work of the IOSCO Committee on Retail Investors is going to be critically important in developing a toolkit. But in Ontario, I'd say there's a couple. In Canada, there's a couple different approaches. So on the one hand, there is regulating and activity, or considering what should be in our regulatory perimeter, and being clear about regulatory expectations. So particularly where someone is actively giving advice, is being compensated for that directly or indirectly. There's certain activities that are within our perimeter, and we need to be clear about that. But that said, Gerri already alluded to it. A lot of influencers have no idea they're edging or have crossed the line into registrable activity. They should be, in the US case, an investment advisor. So there's also an element of influence, tongue-in-cheek, I'll use that, where we need to reach out to that community, whether it's through social media or providing tools to influencers to help them do better. In Canada, there's an example. It's not Finfluencers. It's but there's an initiative to create essentially an online hub of ESG messages, not in the investing context, but climate-related messages that climate influencers can use in their own content, but that is from authoritative sources. So facts and figures are correct, and they can rely on this central hub. That's providing and equipping influencers with tools to provide accurate information to their audience. So that's kind of working with influencers. There's also ways to develop guides and toolkits. That is something we're considering as well. So best practices for the influencers. That stops short of guidance and regulation. And then, of course, there's investor education, and that's a critical component of our toolkit. Again, we can use technology to our advantage. One of the initiatives that we've done in this area in Canada, in Ontario, has been targeted paid social media posts. So as opposed to organic social media, we'll actually pay to promote messages specifically about influencer activity and how investors should engage and things to watch out for. But we're able to do the same sort of targeting and micro approaches that influencers and others use, using algorithms, the targeting available through social media. If you went to our social media feeds, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, we're on many channels, you wouldn't necessarily see these. This is not organic social media, but we're able to do fairly robust and precise targeting. To use one example, we can we can target our influencer awareness or education campaigns based on who they follow. So if they're following Kim Kardashian and all other influencers, we can target people who are following these individuals. I gave a celebrity example, but we could also target based on, lesser actors. Not commenting on Kim Kardashian's acting skills, lesser actors in the space. But there's a lot of tools at our disposal to proactively push out information and insert ourselves into that conversation.
And I would underscore, bold, and italicize what Tyler just said about the tools that regulators have in their toolkits already, with the rules that they already have. And it's important to use those tools. And so along that line, FINRA back in 2021 started a sweep of firms looking at their relationships with affiliates that were helping them with their marketing, and that included Finfluencers. And so in connection with that sweep, a regulatory examination, the Advertising Regulation Department at FINRA examined over 1,000 social media posts, about a third of which were on a third of which were on YouTube, a third of which were on Instagram, about 20% were on TikTok, and the remainder were on Twitter. And, 7 in 10 of those posts did not comply with the disclosure rules and the don't make projections, the don't make false claims, do's and don'ts of what one can do in communicating with the public. But we're working with our enforcement department on some disciplinary actions that might arise out of this. We've also provided guidance to the industry to help them better have written supervisory procedures, the things that I talked about earlier, to give guidance to the industry so that they hopefully won't be crossing those fine lines. The other thing that we did gets to something that Tyler mentioned, was that we as regulators need to be talking to the Finfluencer community. And along that vein, FINRA recently sponsored a panel at a prominent conference in the United States that brings together bloggers and video bloggers, so vloggers, other social media influencers, people that are content creators in the financial space and other spaces, to talk to them about the rules of the road. And there's no single comprehensive legislation or approach to the regulation of financial influence, but there are rules of the road when it comes to straight out advertising. And our Federal Trade Commission in the United States is the body that enforces the truth in advertising rules that we have in the United States. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a role with banks and other financial institutions. We brought together representatives from those two agencies, also from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and someone from our FINRA advertising regulation, to talk about the rules of the road. And the Finfluencers that were in the room were extraordinarily engaged. They wanted to understand how to not cross those lines, and they had a lot of questions about where those lines might be. And so starting that dialogue, if it means going out to where the content creators are, that can be uncomfortable for financial regulators. And trust me, we had to get layers and layers and layers of approval to sponsor this panel for this conference. But it ended up being an incredibly valuable thing, and we hope that it pays dividends in the years to come.
I think that's definitely an interesting avenue for the regulators in the room as well to consider, I'm sure. So I suppose we alluded to this as well earlier in the discussion, the fact that the internet is really, truly borderless in a way that nothing else really is, I feel, in this day and age. So we've talked a bit about the regulatory tools that can be employed. But what happens when you're looking at activities of concern that are not tied to jurisdictional boundaries? Perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about sort of navigating navigating those kinds of waters? What kind of conversations need to be had, perhaps, that perhaps are already being had or still need to be had going forward?
Well, this is where the work of IOSCO and the collaboration of international regulators is so important. And so, you know, the Asia Pacific Hub, bringing people together to talk about it in this jurisdiction, this area, is super, super, super important. But when you think about the tools that have been used to commit crimes, to commit frauds on the internet, social media isn't the first example. Email hack attacks that were being launched in, you know, against US citizens, against citizens of virtually every country represented in this room. The cross-border frauds have been dealt with through cooperative enforcement efforts. And so it's important to lean on the very good offices of an entity like IOSCO and the memoranda of understanding that countries have with one another about these issues.
No, you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, the work of IOSCO is more important than ever. The work coming out of the Retail Market Conduct Task Force and the follow-on work, we've already talked about some of the streams, including Finfluencer, copy trading. I mean, these are all really timely issues for IOSCO to be addressing as the global standard setter in securities regulation. The issue of international standard setting, of bilateral cooperation. I mean, every time I come to a C8 meeting, I'm always struck once again by how similar some of our issues are and how much we can learn from each other. You know, there's just such a wealth of knowledge among IOSCO members, and again, kudos to the Asia Pacific Hub for organizing this workshop, because we can learn from each other, apply best practices in our jurisdictions, and work together. It's a borderless world on the internet and on social media, and we need to work together.
So perhaps on that note, I could open the floor to questions.
Well, I commented earlier, thank you for the question. I agree there's a big role to play. I commented earlier on the connection between media literacy and financial literacy. I think we, in addition to working collectively as securities regulators and financial regulators, we have a role to engage with regulators in other jurisdictions or with other mandates. We may not have the regulatory authority over the platforms themselves, but others may. They're obviously very challenging conversations. I mean, in the United States and Canada, and I think in many jurisdictions around the world, there's definitely an aversion by platforms to being regulated in any form, depending on which platform we're talking about in particular, Elon Musk or others. No, but I agree. It absolutely has to be part of the conversation, whether that's our role as securities regulators or not, or being part of that conversation is a question.
All right, thank you so much. Any other questions from the floor at this time? No? Okay. While questions, I'm sure, no doubt, percolate, perhaps we could just, I suppose, dig into a little bit of what are the key areas, like if these regulators in the audience were to leave this workshop, what are the, like 2 or 3 perhaps key things that you would want them to take away and take back to their teams in their home jurisdictions?
We're not upset, there's no questions, because we're with a lot of our colleagues from Committee 8. I know Gerri and I will both be happy to answer questions from people who watch this webcast after the fact, so our contact information will be made available. But I guess one takeaway, I mean, there's a lot of work underway at the IOSCO level and the local jurisdiction level that is critically important. We'll develop toolkits and practices, but that may take longer. There are things we can all do today and are doing today in terms of investor education, getting on the platforms where Finfluencers are active and being part of that conversation. That work can start today if you haven't already. To the extent there's conversations that you need to have internally with your peers or with decision makers who may be not as comfortable yet, I think you can point to other jurisdictions who have dipped their toes in that water or stepped fully in and learn from each other and point to best practices that are already in play to build up comfort level if that's an issue in your local jurisdiction.
And the one thing that I would add to what Tyler already said is that you do have tools in your toolkit to deal with this issue. So deploying those will be incredibly valuable as you wait for the C8 report on Finfluencer activity.
As I suppose a creative application exercise, I suppose you could say.
Yes, it can happen, and it's been happening for decades. It's new for securities regulators to be applying this in our work, but certainly in a business context, in a marketing context, in a sales context, the concepts around behavioral insights and science have been utilized for a long, long time. So like a lot of things, like technology, like tactics, they can be used for good or for ill. And so that's why it's important for us as regulators to be applying it as well. But absolutely, it is happening. It is partly what makes a lot of these channels and influencers effective, and we need to be aware of it.
And within our Department of Regulatory Economics and Market Analysis, there are PhD economists who have a strong consumer finance interest, and while we don't have a behavioral insights unit, we have been doing explorations to better understand how some of the tactics that firms are using to engage with investors using digital engagement practices, how those are influencing behavior. And we're keeping an eye on research that other bodies have done, whether academics or other regulatory bodies, to understand the impact of some of the different types of digital engagement practices, which are the firms using behavioral tactics to try to gain customers or steer behaviors. And some of the things we were interested when we did some of the work with younger investors, not the CFA Institute study per se, but some other work that FINRA Foundation did with NORC at the University of Chicago. We looked at what was driving investor behavior, and things like the ability to invest with small dollar amounts was far more influential than confetti or a reward. But there were some investors for whom those kinds of enticements were quite persuasive. And so it's important to understand that. One of the distinguishers was the level of investment knowledge. That investments with lower levels of investment knowledge were more likely to be influenced by the more game-like tactics compared to investors who had higher levels of investment knowledge. Just understanding that baseline alone is valuable for regulators.
Thank you so much for your question. Are there any other questions from the floor? Perhaps we could take one more before we close. No? Okay. I suppose after this as well, if anyone has any very specific questions that they'd like to address to Tyler and Gerri, please by all means. I don't think they'd have any issue with being approached after the fact. No, certainly not.
Delighted.
All right. And of course, if you have any questions at a later time, please feel free to forward them to the team at the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub, who will reach out to Tyler and Gerri for their opinions, as well likewise to those who will be watching this at a later date on the video recording. All right. And with that, perhaps, let us give a big round of applause to our distinguished experts this evening, Tyler Fleming and Gerri Walsh. So we've had a very fruitful discussion. We've covered a fair bit of ground. We discussed some Gen Z specific behaviors when it comes to financial decisions. We discussed the importance of disclosure. We discussed the regulatory toolkits that perhaps already exist and how regulators can then kind of reapply them in different ways in order to address this new and developing area. But of course, it is very much a developing area, and no doubt there is going to be a lot more focus on this in the days to come, particularly with the work that IOSCO is doing at this present time. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you as well to Pasquale and Gloria for earlier setting the scene for us.